Upper East Side, Manhattan. Tuesday morning! 3 days before the most important event the Rourke family had seen in a decade. The pen stopped moving. That was the first sign. In 7 years, nobody in that study had ever made Damien Rourke's hand stop moving. She was standing in the center of his office in ripped jeans and beat-up sneakers, a worn backpack over one shoulder, looking at him the way no one had looked at him since before Connor died, like he was just a man. Not a name. Not a threat. Just a man. He set the pen down slowly. Uniform policy applies to all staff. She didn't blink. "I'm aware," she said. "I won't be following it." The bodyguard in the corner forgot how to breathe. 3 guards. 1 door! And a girl from the South Bronx who had just told the most dangerous man in New York no, and was still standing. Damien Rourke rose from his chair. He crossed the room, stopped 1 foot from her face. "Do you know who you're speaking to?" She tilted her chin up. Dark eyes. Steady hands. And something in her expression that he couldn't name, the specific calm of someone who had already survived the worst thing that would ever happen to her and was no longer afraid of anything that came after. "Yes," she said quietly. "You're my mother's employer. She's given this house 18 years. I'm here because she's lying in a hospital bed tonight and still worried about your gala." A pause. "The real question is, do you know who you're speaking to?" The room went dead silent. And Damien Rourke, the man whose name made this city flinch, did something no one in that room had ever seen him do before. He froze. He didn't know her name yet. Didn't know about Philadelphia, about the scar beneath that leather bracelet, about the 4 years she'd spent putting herself back together from something no one should survive. He only knew one thing in that moment. Whatever was about to happen in this house, it started right here. This is the story of Elena Vasquez, the girl who walked into the lion's den wearing ripped jeans, and the man who looked at her and for the first time in 7 years forgot who he was supposed to be. The crack in the wall was still there, same zigzag, same spot, right above the 3rd floor light switch. Elena had looked at that crack every day from age 6 to age 19, and now she was 27, and it hadn't moved an inch. 4 years, she thought. I went everywhere I could think of, and this wall didn't move. Her suitcase was still by the door, wheels still dirty from the airport. She hadn't unpacked. She told herself she would do it tomorrow. That was 3 days ago. Then her phone rang. Her mother's voice was thinner than she remembered. There was a cough living inside every sentence now, quiet but persistent, like something that had moved in and wasn't planning to leave. Pneumonia, the doctor said. Serious enough for bed rest. Serious enough that Carmen Vasquez, who had worked through a broken wrist in 2019 and a migraine so bad she could barely see, was actually listening to him. The Rourke estate. "Baby, just 1 week. They have a big event." Elena sat down on the edge of the bed. "Mom, I know. I just got home. I know, Mija." "I know." She looked at her unpacked suitcase, at the crack in the wall, at the window that faced the same brick building it had always faced. She said, "Fine." The word tasted like something she hadn't chosen, which is probably what it was. But her mother's breathing was thin on the other end of the line, and some arguments aren't worth having out loud. She picked her outfit carefully the next morning. Faded jeans, ripped at both knees. White t-shirt, knotted at the waist. Her beat-up sneakers, the ones she'd bought on sale in Philadelphia, and walked approximately half the city in. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at herself for a moment. She was not dressing to impress anyone. She was dressing the way she dressed. That was the whole point. For 3 years inside her marriage, she hadn't chosen what she wore. Small thing, maybe, to someone who hadn't lived it. Not small to her. The clothes were just clothes. The choice was everything. She covered her left wrist with the leather bracelet her grandmother had braided for her the last summer before she died. Then she picked up her bag and went downstairs. The cab crossed from the Bronx into Manhattan, and the city changed around her block by block. Wider sidewalks, quieter streets, a particular kind of clean that costs money to maintain. The driver glanced at her in the rear view. First time in the Upper East Side. My mother's worked there 18 years. He nodded slowly. Then, good luck, miss. Rich people, they're not always kind to people like us. She sat with that phrase the rest of the ride. People like us. 3 words. An entire world compressed into 3 words. Said like it was obvious. Like it had always been this way and always would be. Maybe the saddest part was how normal it felt to hear it. The gates were black iron. Enormous. The kind that exists to remind you where you stand before you've said a single word. 2 guards. Arms crossed. The scan started at her face and moved downward. Slow and deliberate. Like she was an inventory item they weren't sure about. Deliveries go around back. I'm not a delivery. She kept her voice even. My name is Elena Vasquez. Carmen Vasquez is my mother. She's been head housekeeper here for 18 years. I'm covering for her this week while she recovers from pneumonia. The guard looked at her jeans, her sneakers, the knotted t-shirt. The help usually dresses differently. Here's what she learned in 4 years of putting herself back together. Anger is fuel, and fuel, spent wrong, leaves you empty when you need it most. I'm sure they do, she said. You can verify my name with the house. Or I can call a cab back to the Bronx and you can explain to Mr. Rourke why his event coordinator is missing 3 days before the gala. Your call. The younger guard covered his mouth with his hand. The older one picked up the phone. The gates opened. The housekeeper who met her at the front door was 60, silver-haired, with the posture of someone who had decided a long time ago that the world would adjust to her and not the other way around. You have your mother's eyes. The woman said, not warmly, not coldly, just as a fact, and her stubborn chin. Lord help this house. She stepped aside. I'm Nora Walsh. Follow me. The entrance hall was enormous painted ceiling, marble floors, a chandelier that probably cost more than Elena's entire apartment building. She didn't stop to stare. She cataloged it the way she'd cataloged hospital rooms, systematically, efficiently, looking for what the space said about the people inside it. Outside the last door at the end of a long hallway, Nora paused. One thing before you go in, she said quietly. Mr. Rourke is not what people say he is, but he's not what you might hope, either. He's something harder than both. What is he? A man carrying a debt he never agreed to. She knocked, a low voice from inside. Come in. The study had 3 walls of books, real ones used, marked, some of them cracked at the spine. Elena's eyes moved across them the way they always moved across a new room, looking for information. Gray's Anatomy, Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine. And on the corner of the smaller, open and tabbed in 3 colors, a slim black wire-bound notebook, the kind with a red cross embossed in the lower right corner. She knew that notebook. She had owned one exactly like it during her nursing clinicals. The Columbia Medical School bookstore edition. Not something you found by accident. She registered it in about 2 seconds. Then she moved her eyes away. The man behind the main desk hadn't looked up yet. Dark hair, white shirt, sleeves rolled, a scar that ran from his left temple toward the edge of his jaw. He was reading something, pen in hand, giving no indication that 2 people had just walked into his room. Nora announced her. His hands stopped moving. He looked up, and he went completely still. It lasted less than 3 seconds. Elena counted them. Later, she would think about what she must have looked like in that moment, tired from the cab ride, wearing ripped jeans, holding the strap of a beat-up backpack. Not remarkable by any measure she could name. She didn't know, then, what he was seeing. She didn't know about Connor, about the notebook. About the last 8 months, his brother had carried one, exactly like the one she just looked at, and looked away from the gesture of someone trained to notice things and respectful enough not to make them into a moment. All she knew was that the most feared man in New York had frozen when he saw her. She had no idea why. He set his pen down. You're Carmen's daughter, he said, flat, measured, not a question. Elena Vasquez, she said. I'll be covering my mother's duties this week. He looked at her for another second. Then his eyes dropped just briefly to her left wrist. The bracelet. She saw him register it. She saw him decide not to speak. His jaw tightened slightly. The uniform policy applies to all staff, he said. Elena looked at him. I'm aware, she said. I won't be following it. The room went very quiet. The guard in the corner, the large one, the one who hadn't left, stared at her like she just announced she could fly. Damien Rourke said nothing for a long moment. Then, clear the room. Everyone left. The door clicked shut, and Elena stood alone with him in the silence, thinking, well, here we go. Elena was up at 5:15. Old hospital habit. Her body didn't ask her permission anymore. It just swung her legs over the side of the bed, and that was that. She washed her face, pulled her hair back, and was in the ballroom by 5:30 with a legal pad and a pen. She worked the way she'd learned to work in nursing. Move through the space first. Don't touch anything yet. Just look. Read the room the way you'd read a patient what's missing. What's wrong? What's been ignored so long that everyone stopped seeing it? It took her 40 minutes. By the time Nora arrived at 6, Elena had 2 pages of notes and a ranked list. Nora stood in the doorway, reading over her shoulder without being invited. She read the whole thing without speaking. Then, when did you do this? Just now. It's 6 in the morning. The chandelier situation alone would have taken an hour to fix if we caught it the day of, Elena said. Dust on the upper rigging. Under full light, it goes yellow. Looks cheap. And the table positioning needs to shift about 18 inches toward the east window. The guests of honor won't have a sightline to the garden otherwise. Nora looked at the list, then at Elena. Carmen taught you this. Carmen showed me how to see a room, the way the person who owns it sees it. Elena uncapped her pen and moved toward the east bar. Nursing taught me the rest. When you take care of people for a living, you learn to read a space. What it says, what it's missing, what the person inside it is trying to tell you without words. She held a wine glass up to the gray morning light coming through the east window. Wrong shape. Wrong bowl entirely. These glasses will mute the bouquet on the Rosadoro pour, she said. Is there another set? Nora was quiet for a moment. Something had shifted in her expression. The mild suspicion she'd walked in with had become something else. Not warmth exactly. More like attention. The kind you give something when you realize it's more than you expected. Storage room. East wing. Nora said. I'll show you. Upstairs. In the study. Marcus set a folder on the desk. Background on Elena Vasquez, he said. Clean record. Nursing license out of Pennsylvania. Inactive. 4-year gap between her last New York address and now Philadelphia. Damien didn't open the folder. He was looking at the security feed on his laptop. The ballroom camera. Elena. Moving through the space with her legal pad. Stopping to examine a chandelier rigging. Crouching to check the base of a floral arrangement. Talking to Nora with a focus that made the two of them look like they were planning a surgery rather than a dinner party. She noticed the Harrisons. Marcus said. Damien looked up. Yesterday, I watched her eyes move across the bookshelf. They stopped on the medical titles. Stayed there 2 seconds. Marcus paused. Then she moved on. She didn't ask about it. No, she decided not to. He let that sit for a moment. That's a different thing. Damien looked back at the screen. On the feed, Elena was redirecting a delivery driver to the correct entrance, gesturing clearly, not wasting a word. He closed the laptop. He didn't open the folder either. 7 years ago, 2 in the morning, this same kitchen. Connor was sitting at the table, letting Damien clean a cut on his hand, something minor from something they weren't going to talk about. Damien worked the way he always worked. Clean, methodical, no extra motion. Connor watched him. You know you're going to be a better doctor than anything this family ever produced. You say that every time, because it's true every time. Connor flexed his newly bandaged fingers. Dami, I need you to promise me something. What? Don't let this family take that from you. He said it quietly, looking at his hand. Whatever happens to me, don't let it take that. Damien didn't answer. He was putting the kid away. He told himself he'd answer later. There would be time later. 48 hours later, Connor was on the ground in a parking lot in Red Hook. And Damien's hands were pressed to the wound. And everything he'd learned in 4 years at Columbia couldn't do a thing about the look in his brother's eyes as they went still. He buried his stethoscope the same week. Put it in the box. Put the box in the closet. Didn't open it for 3 years. He told himself it was the right thing. That running the family was what Connor would have wanted. That keeping his dream alive would have been selfish. Somehow, a betrayal of what his brother died for. He had been wrong about this for 7 years. And somewhere underneath the running of the empire, and the suits, and the reputation, he knew it. He just hadn't figured out what to do with knowing it yet. Dinner in the kitchen that evening was louder than Elena expected. She sat down at the staff table without being directed to and without asking if it was all right. She just sat. The other staff members watched her with the careful sideways attention of people who have learned not to react too fast to anything unusual. She didn't talk about herself. She asked about them. Maria, who ran the secondary kitchen, had a daughter in her sophomore year of high school who wanted to study engineering. Elena asked her name, asked what kind of engineering. Listened to the answer the way she used to listen to patients, like it was the most important thing in the room. Jake, who drove the house cars, was finishing a paralegal certificate at night. 2 more semesters. He was tired. But the way people are tired when they're building toward something. Priya, one of the housekeepers, sent money home to Gujarat every month. Her parents were getting older. She was doing the math in her head constantly. How long she could keep this up. How much longer they'd need her to. Elena listened to all of it, not because she was performing warmth, because she knew what it felt like to be in a room where no one was listening to you. 4 years of that. 3 in a marriage and 1 trying to remember who she was afterward. You don't forget the weight of being invisible. By the end of the meal, the table was easier, less guarded. Nora sat beside her as the others cleared up. Your mother did this every night, she said quietly. Knew every name, every birthday, every family situation on this staff. She always said Elena thought about how to put it. She said, if you can't remember that the person cleaning your bathroom has a whole life outside that room, you've lost something. Something important. Something that's hard to get back. Nora was quiet for a moment. She said something like that to Connor once, years ago. She paused. He wrote it down. Elena looked at her, but Nora stood up and started clearing cups. And the conversation was apparently done. For now, past midnight. Elena couldn't sleep. This wasn't new. For years, she'd trained herself to stay alert at night. It was a habit she'd built for survival and couldn't fully unlearn. Even now that the thing she'd survived was 2 years and 400 miles behind her, her body still kept watch. She was working on it. Her therapist called it a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. Elena called it inconvenient. She walked the staff corridor slowly, not exploring, just moving. There was a hallway she hadn't been shown, shorter than the others. A door at the end with a thin line of amber light underneath. She heard pages turning. She looked through the gap. Damien Rourke was not at his estate desk. He was at a small oak table plain. No ornamentation, the kind of furniture you buy because it works. In front of him, a medical textbook flattened open, 3 highlighters in different colors, and a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting. Not notes for a meeting. Real notes. The kind with arrows and question marks and words underlined twice and written again in the margin. He was studying. Not reviewing. Studying the total absorption of someone trying to learn something they intend to use. She recognized it because she'd done it herself at a similar table, at a similar hour. During the years when she was trying to become something, she watched for 10 seconds. Then she stepped back. You can come in if you want. She stopped, stood there for a moment, then pushed the door open. He didn't close the textbook. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked at her with the expression of someone who's been caught doing something private and has decided, for reasons he hasn't fully worked out, to let it stay visible. She sat in the chair across the table, uninvited. He didn't object. She looked at the open page, a diagram of the brachial plexus, annotated heavily in blue. 7 years, she said, not accusing, just naming it. Yes, and you're still buying updated editions. The Harrisons I have is 2 editions behind, he said. The current one came out 14 months ago. I ordered it the week it was published. She looked at him for a moment. That's not the behavior of someone who's given up, she said. He didn't respond to that. But he didn't disagree with it either. Go back to sleep. Elena, she stood. At the door, she stopped. I won't say anything about this. I know, not because you're my employer. Pause. I know that too, he said. She left him there. The amber light. The textbook. the legal pad covered in writing. A man who had buried his dream out of guilt and then spent 7 years quietly refusing to let it die. She thought about that for a long time before she fell asleep. Day 2 started the same as day 1 early. Quiet. Elena moving through the ballroom before the light was fully in. She'd added Diego to her rotation. He was 19, new to the job, and moved through the estate like someone who was constantly expecting to do something wrong. She recognized that particular posture. She'd worn it herself once. She put him on the chandelier rigging not because it was easy, but because it required attention and patience. And she'd watched him long enough to know he had both. Like this, she said, showing him the cloth angle. Not across, vertical first, then horizontal. You'll cover more surface and you won't leave streaks. He tried it better immediately. How do you know all this? He asked. My mother. First, then 4 years of making mistakes in spaces that didn't belong to me. She moved to the next fixture. And nursing. Once you know how to triage what's urgent, what can wait? What looks fine but isn't every other kind of work gets clearer. Do you miss it? Nursing. She thought about that honestly. She'd been practicing honesty lately. It took more effort than people assumed. I miss the feeling of having done something that mattered at the end of a shift, she said. I'm working on finding that in other ways. Diego nodded like he understood more than she'd said. Maybe he did. From the second floor railing, Damien watched. He didn't come down. He watched her redirect a floral delivery to the correct entrance, settle a vendor dispute without raising her voice, and demonstrate a chandelier pulley adjustment to a teenager she'd known for approximately 6 hours. He watched for 11 minutes. Then Marcus appeared at his shoulder with a reminder about a call, and he went. The black car arrived at 11:15. Elena was crossing the entrance hall when it pulled up. She didn't stop. She had a supply list to verify, but she slowed when the front door opened, and a woman walked in who moved like the room had been designed around her. Red dress, perfect curls. Makeup so precise, it looked like a separate decision from the rest of her face. She was beautiful in the specific ways of someone who has spent a long time making sure of it. But what Elena noticed, what she always noticed, because she'd been trained to read people before she'd been trained to read anything else, was the fatigue underneath. Not tired from sleep fatigue, the deeper kind, the kind that comes from being managed. In the sitting room, Celeste put her arms around Damien's neck in greeting. He received it carefully. Didn't pull back, didn't lean in. The way you accept something you didn't order but don't want to return in front of anyone. Elena kept walking. She'd gotten 3 steps past the doorway when she heard, "You must be Elena." She turned. Celeste was looking at her from across the sitting room. Her eyes did the thing, the quick full body read that certain women are trained into from childhood. But underneath the assessment, something else. Something Elena couldn't name yet. Yes, covering for my mother this week. Carmen talks about you constantly. Celeste said. She says you're a nurse. I was. What happened? Elena looked at her steadily. Life happened. I'm working on what comes next. Celeste held her gaze a beat longer than necessary. Aren't we all? She said quietly. It wasn't small talk. Elena filed it away. Late afternoon. Elena was moving through the east corridor toward the storage rooms when she heard Damien's voice through a closed door. She wasn't eavesdropping. She just stopped. He was talking to 2 men she didn't recognize. His voice was the same as always, low. Controlled. No wasted energy. He was explaining, calmly and with complete precision, what would happen to a specific business interest if a specific person continued to be uncooperative. He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing. He didn't need to. The weight of it was in the stillness of it, in what was left unsaid at the edges of every sentence. You have until Friday. After Friday, the conversation changes. You won't enjoy the new format. Elena walked on. That evening, she wrote in her notebook a habit she'd started in Philadelphia when she couldn't afford a therapist and needed somewhere to put things. He was a different person in that room. Not cruel. Exactly. Something colder than cruel. Cruel requires feeling something about the person on the receiving end. He didn't seem to feel anything at all. That's its own kind of dangerous. I've been telling myself the textbooks and the clinic are the real him. But maybe they're both real. Maybe people don't get to be only one thing. I've asked myself this question before. The last time. I got the answer wrong. I'm not doing that again. She closed the notebook. She didn't throw it away. The next morning, Elena was arranging flowers in the west sitting room when Celeste appeared with 2 cups of coffee. No greeting, just set one down near Elena's elbow and sat on the low chair by the window. Elena kept working. I'm not going to warn you away from Damien, Celeste said. Good. I'm here to do a job. I know. She looked into her cup. Can I tell you something? Off the record, as much as anything in this house is off the record. Elena put down the flowers and turned. Go ahead. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said it plainly, without performance. The way people speak when they've run out of energy for anything else. I'm not marrying Damien because I want to. I'm marrying him because my father needs me to. 3 years ago, James Hargrove made some financial decisions that would put him away for a very long time if they became public. Damien's legal infrastructure is the only thing that keeps that from happening. The engagement is the arrangement. Elena looked at her. Does Damien know? He knows enough. He has his own reasons for the arrangement. Neither of us is being deceived. She paused. We're both just being used. By my father's situation and by the logic that keeps this family operational. That sounds like a very elegant way to describe being trapped. Celeste looked at her, then really looked. For the first time. Something in her face opened slightly. Unguarded, the first real thing Elena had seen from her. It is, she said. But it's the trap I know. The alternative is watching my father destroy himself and take people down with him. He won't stop on his own. He never has. Have you thought about being the one to stop him? Silence. Long enough to mean something. Every day, Celeste said, I just haven't found an exit that doesn't cost everything I have left. Elena looked at her for a moment. This woman was not her enemy. This was someone doing the math on her own escape every single day and not finding numbers that worked. When you find one, Elena said quietly, I hope you take it. Celeste didn't respond, but something in her posture shifted small. Barely visible, like a door that had been locked for a long time, moving a fraction of an inch. Coercion doesn't always look like what we think it looks like. It doesn't always come with raised voices or visible bruises. Sometimes it comes from someone who loves you or someone who raised you who has leverage and is willing to use it. A father who holds a secret like a hand of cards, playing them out one at a time to keep his daughter at the table. This is a form of control that society rarely names. Because it happens behind closed doors and in polite language, and the person doing it can usually make a very convincing case that they're doing it for everyone's good. Celeste Hargrove was 30 years old and had never made a major decision about her own life that her father hadn't approved first. She had stopped noticing this the way you stop noticing a sound that's always been there. Sophia Rourke arrived by rideshare no house car. No announcement. She came in through the side door with a backpack over one shoulder and her earbuds in one ear, scanning something on her phone. She nearly walked into Elena in the hallway, stopped, looked up, did a quick, unashamed assessment. You must be the one who told my brother he doesn't know who he's talking to. Word travels fast. Marcus texted me within the hour. He never texts me. She pulled out her earbuds and pocketed them. Sophia Rourke, third-year law at NYU. Victim Advocacy Unit. Genuinely terrible at small talk. I already like you, and I haven't decided yet if that's a compliment. I'll take it either way. Sophia fell into step beside her as if they'd been walking together for years. She talked the way she thought fast. Following threads, circling back to things she'd said 2 sentences ago. She asked about nursing without condescension. She mentioned the advocacy clinic without self-congratulation. She talked about Connor, the way Elena had noticed. People talked about someone who was gone, but not finished present tense when she forgot. Past tense when she caught herself. Connor would have liked you, she said. He had a thing for people who didn't perform for him. I'm not performing, Elena said. I'm working? Yeah, Sophia said. That's what I mean. Late that night, after everyone else had gone to bed. Celeste stood at her window. Below, the West Garden was dark and still. She took out her phone, scrolled to a contact with no name, typed a message, and looked at it for a moment. Proceed with what we discussed. She sent it. She set the phone down on the windowsill and looked at her own reflection in the dark glass. The woman looking back at her was wearing a silk robe and no makeup, and she looked for the first time all week like herself. What James Hargrove didn't know, what he'd never bothered to find out. because he'd never found it useful to understand his daughter, was that Celeste had been inside this estate 3 times before this week. She knew the layout. She knew the staff rotation. She knew the security system's coverage map because she'd studied it on her second visit, the way she studied everything quietly, methodically, without telling anyone what she was doing or why. She knew exactly where camera 47 was positioned in the wine cellar. She knew exactly what angle it covered. She was not going to make a mistake. She was going to make a choice, the first real one she'd had in 3 years. It would cost her. Everything worth doing usually did. She stayed at the window for a long time before she went to bed. 5:30 in the morning. Elena came downstairs for coffee and found Damien already there. She could tell it was unusual by the way Nora moved around the kitchen, wider orbit, quicker steps. The adjustments people make without realizing they're making them. He didn't normally come downstairs at this hour. Something had kept him up, or gotten him up, or pulled him here. She didn't ask which. He was standing at the window with his cup, not looking at anything in particular. Somewhere else entirely. She poured her coffee, started to leave. Then, on an impulse she didn't fully examine, the Harrisons on your secondary desk. The one with the blue tabs. She kept her voice casual. That's not light reading. He didn't turn from the window. A long pause. I was in my final year at Columbia, he said, 7 years ago. She didn't ask what happened. She'd read enough of this house to know. 7 years is a long time to keep buying updated editions, she said. He finally looked at her. You said that before! It bears repeating. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The kitchen was quiet, outside. The city was doing what the city does at 5:30 barely. Reluctantly, waking up. The one I have now is 2 editions behind, he said. The current came out 14 months ago. I ordered it the week it was released. What does that tell you? That I'm still keeping the door open. He looked back at the window. What it doesn't tell me is whether I'll ever walk through it. Elena nodded slowly. Picked up her coffee. The door doesn't expire, she said. That's the thing people get wrong about it. She left him with that. Nora found it at 9 in the morning. A flower arrangement on the main dining table, the spot where Elena had been taking her meals. White flowers. Formal and expensive. Tucked in among the regular morning setup like they belonged. No card. Nora stood very still looking at it. Then she called for Marcus. Marcus came. Took one look. Went still in a completely different way, the stillness of someone who has recognized something and is now thinking very fast behind a very calm face. He photographed it. Went to Damien. The room got quiet in a specific way when Damien looked at the photo. Who let it in? Came through the service entrance with the regular floral delivery. Mixed in. Marcus paused. The arrangement was placed specifically. That table. That seat. Damien set the phone down. Change Elena's seating arrangement starting tonight. Tell her it's for the gala setup. She'll figure it out, probably. He looked at the photo one more time. Don't tell her yet. Not until I understand what this is. He turned the phone face down. Sal Marchetti had not made a threat. He'd done something worse. He demonstrated knowledge. He knew someone new had arrived. He knew which chair she sat in. He was telling Damien he knew, and he was doing it with white flowers. Because elegance has always been its own particular kind of menace. White flowers. No card, just I see you. I see who you brought in. I'm watching. Damien stood at the window of his study for a while after Marcus left. He thought about Elena in the kitchen an hour ago, holding her coffee cup with both hands, telling him the door doesn't expire. The matter-of-fact certainty of it. He thought about the white flowers on her chair. He thought about what it would mean if Marchetti decided she was relevant. James Hargrove arrived at 6 for dinner. Elena didn't meet him formally. She was coordinating the evening setup and moved in and out of rooms where he sat, visible in the peripheral way that service staff are expected to be visible, present but not acknowledged. She watched him anyway. James Hargrove was the kind of man who made every room feel like he called the meeting. Silver-haired, easy smile, the confidence of someone who had spent decades having his presence treated as the most important one. He told a long, helpful-sounding story over drinks about a regulatory issue with the Rourke property portfolio framed as assistance, full of the language of partnership and mutual interest. Elena, carrying a tray through the adjoining corridor, caught enough of it to notice how the framing worked. James always positioned himself as the person who understood the problem, and the person who understood the problem was Naturally, the person who should be trusted with the solution. Later, she heard them in the east hallway, James and Celeste. Low voices. She was passing through. She wasn't trying to listen, but she slowed. James, steady and quiet. The Vasquez girl is getting attention she doesn't need to be getting. Celeste, she's doing her job. That's not what I mean. Pause. Then Celeste's voice. Flat in a way that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with practice. What do you want me to do? Not a question, a recitation. Be present. Remind Damien what this arrangement is worth. We can't afford his attention wandering. Long silence. And if I don't, James, without missing a beat. Then we revisit the Cayman account conversation, which neither of us enjoys. Elena kept walking. She turned the corner and stopped in the empty corridor, back against the wall, looking at nothing. She knew that dynamic. Not those exact words. Different words. Same structure. Someone with leverage using it like a hand wrapped around your wrist. Not quite tight enough to leave a mark, just tight enough to steer. She had a scar that told a different story about how that usually ended. I know what it looks like, she thought. When someone has been told they have no choices so many times that they've stopped looking for them. I know because I used to be her. The difference between Celeste and me isn't money or education. It's that someone, on a specific night in Philadelphia, looked at me and told me I was wrong about how few options I had. She picked up her tray and kept walking. 11 o'clock, the house settling into quiet. Elena went down to the wine cellar to finish the inventory she hadn't completed the day before. Stone walls, warm amber light, the particular silence of a room that has been holding old things carefully for a long time. She was halfway through the rack list when she heard the stairs. She knew the footstep. She'd been learning the sounds of this house, the way she used to learn the sounds of a ward who moved fast, who moved slow, who paused at the nurse's station, who went straight to the room. Damien came down, stopped when he saw her. I can finish and give you the space, she said. Stay. He took a bottle from the open section, poured 2 glasses, set one near her without comment, and moved to the far end of the cellar. He wasn't checking on her. This was where he came to think. She'd figured that out 2 days ago. They existed in the same room for a while without needing it to be anything. Elena had almost forgotten this was possible. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand to be filled. Eventually, she asked, if someone left something they cared about, not because they wanted to, but because something happened, do you think they could go back to it? He thought about it. Actually thought. Depends on whether they still believe they're the person who wanted it, he said, or whether what happened changed that. What if both are true? Then the question isn't whether they can go back. It's what version of themselves they're going back as. She looked at him across the cellar. He was looking at his glass. Why did you come back to New York? He asked. Because running stops working, she said. You can change zip codes indefinitely. Whatever you're carrying moves with you. Eventually, you get tired somewhere new and realize the geography doesn't help. What made you stop? I decided that my opinion of my own life was the only one that actually mattered. She said it simply. That sounds small. It's not small. It took me 4 years in a hospital room and a nurse who said 3 words to me to understand it. What 3 words? This is not your fault. The cellar was very quiet after that. He looked down at his glass. When he spoke, it was careful, like something he'd been turning over and was finally setting on the table to look at. I spent 7 years telling myself that keeping Connor's family going was honoring what he wanted. That going back to what I wanted would be selfish, a betrayal of what he died for. Did he ask you to do that? Damien was quiet for a moment. No, he said. He asked me to do the opposite. She didn't push it. She didn't need to. Some things land better without a response. He looked at her wrist then. The bracelet. He'd noticed it before she'd seen him notice it in the study, the first day. He had the particular control of someone who trained himself not to react to things that surprised him. But she'd caught it. 2 seconds. His eyes on the bracelet. His jaw doing something small. A former medical student would know what a bracelet like that was covering. She'd known that he knew, and she'd watched him choose. Twice now, not to ask. That choice to see and to say nothing was the first genuinely respectful thing anyone had done for her in longer than she wanted to count. He shifted slightly. almost unconsciously repositioning himself so that his side of the room was between her and the stairs. A small thing, barely noticeable. She noticed. They finished the bottle slowly. They talked about other things, the gala, the estate. Nothing important. Comfortable in the way that's rare between people who've only known each other 4 days. When she finally said goodnight and went back upstairs, she stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the wall. She was not naive. She knew what he was. She'd heard him in that room yesterday, the cold precision of it. She hadn't forgotten, but she also knew what she'd seen in the cellar just now. Both things were true. Both. The question she kept circling, the one she didn't have an answer to yet, was what you did when someone was genuinely more than one thing, when the damage and the decency existed in the same person, in equal measure, at the same time. She'd gotten that question wrong before. She wasn't sure yet how to get it right. Upstairs, later. Celeste stood in the dark of the wine cellar doorway. She'd come down for a reason. She knew the route. She'd mapped camera 47's angle on her second visit to this estate. 3 years ago, the way she quietly mapped everything she might someday need. She looked at the wine rack, at the century-old Rosadoro bottle in its position. She looked at the camera. Then she went back upstairs without touching anything. Not tonight. Tomorrow night. After midnight. She would come back, and she would stand in exactly the right spot. And she would look directly into the lens of camera 47, because she needed there to be no question later about who made this choice. She wasn't going to make a mistake. She was going to end this the only way she could see out. Elena was up at 4. Not nerves, strategy. She'd learned in the ICU that the hour before everything started was the only hour that truly belonged to you before the calls came in, before the questions started, before the world decided it needed something from you. You used that hour or you lost it. She used it. By 5:30, she had the ballroom floor plan memorized in a new configuration that accounted for the late RSVP additions. By 6, she had revised the service rotation so no table would wait more than 4 minutes between courses. By 6:45, she had personally inspected every wine glass in the East Bar and set aside 11 that had microchips on the rim. Diego found her in the kitchen at 7, replacing the chipped glasses with the backup set. "Has anyone told you that you're kind of terrifying?" he said. "My mother," Elena said, regularly. He grinned, picked up the replacement tray without being asked. She'd noticed this about Diego over the past 4 days he's watched how she did things. And then he did them that way, not because she'd told him to, because it made sense when he watched. That was the best kind of learning. The kind that came from seeing rather than being told. "How are you this calm?" he asked. The florist called twice. "The lighting guy is threatening to leave. And I just heard Nora tell someone on the phone that the backup champagne order was misrouted to Connecticut because panicking burns fuel I need for fixing," Elena said. She handed him a towel. In nursing, when 3 things go wrong at once, you don't stop and feel it. You stop and sort it. What's urgent? What's important? What can wait? Then you fix the first thing. Then the second. She picked up the next glass. The feeling comes after, when you have room for it. Diego was quiet for a moment. Does it always come after? Always. You can postpone it. You can't cancel it. She said it lightly. But she meant it in more ways than she was going to explain at 7 in the morning to a 19-year-old holding a towel. The guests arrived at 7:30. 300 people, give or take. The kind of crowd that made a room feel both enormous and airless at the same time. Money and power, and the particular social intelligence of people who had spent their entire lives knowing exactly where they stood and why. Elena moved through them like a current, visible when something needed her, gone when it didn't. She developed this skill in hospitals, where the goal was always the same. Make the person you're helping feel like the only thing in the room without making the room aware of you. She was good at it. Damien appeared at 8, black tie. He moved through his guests with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times and found it neither enjoyable nor difficult, just something that happened. His eyes found her within 30 seconds of entering the room. She was at the far end, redirecting a server whose pour was too heavy. She didn't see him looking. She didn't need to. The Rosadoro unveiling was scheduled for 9:15. The century-old bottle, the centerpiece of the whole evening. the symbolic heart of everything the Rourke name was supposed to mean in the legitimate wine world, was brought out on a velvet tray by Nora herself. The room gathered. The lights came down slightly. Damien took the small stage with the effortless authority of someone born to stand in front of crowds. The pour happened. The glasses moved out through the room. Elena was near the east wall, watching the service timing, when she noticed the first guest set his glass down. Then a second. Then a woman across the room put her hand to her mouth. The murmur started the way bad things always started in crowds, as a whisper that found more whispers, picking up speed and volume until it was no longer a whisper at all. Elena went still. 3 minutes later, Celeste moved. She crossed to the stage DJ where Damien stood and spoke clearly enough that the inner ring of guests could hear every word. Damien, I saw the Vasquez girl in the cellar last night, late. She was alone with the wine. The room shifted. Elena felt it that specific. Terrible social physics of a crowd turning. The weight of 300 people recalibrating their opinion of her before she'd had the chance to say a word. She did not wait to be addressed. She moved toward the center of the room. Not running. Not performing. Just closing the distance between herself and the accusation. Because she had learned slowly, expensively, over 4 years that the worst place to be when something came for you was in the corner. She stopped where the room could see her clearly. That's partially true, she said. Her voice was steady. She made sure of it. I was in the cellar last night with Mr. Rourke. We were reviewing the wine inventory together. I did not touch a single bottle that wasn't already opened. The room was very quiet. Celeste pressed forward. Elena could see the calculation behind her eyes, the decision to go further than James Hargrove had scripted. Maybe exactly as far as he'd scripted. And then Celeste said it. Her father stole from the Rourke family. 20 years ago, Victor Vasquez. He disappeared with their money. Betrayal runs in the blood. The whisper moved again. Harder this time. Elena stood in the center of it. Her hands were still. She made sure of that too. And she felt, somewhere underneath the adrenaline and the noise, something clarify. Not anger, not fear. Just clarity. The kind that comes when you have been knocked down enough times that you stop being surprised by the ground and start focusing on getting back up. She raised her voice just enough. My father made choices that hurt people, she said, including my mother, including me. He'll have to live with that. She kept her eyes level and her voice even. But I am not my father's choices. I am mine and my choices in this house. This week have been to do exactly the work I came here to do. Nothing more and nothing less. If that's not enough for this room tonight, I cannot help that. But it's the truth. And I will not apologize for the truth. Silence. Then Damien stepped forward. He had been watching from the stage. He had not rushed to her side. He had watched her speak, watched her stand up in the middle of a room that was turning on her and say what needed to be said before he could say it for her. He nodded at Marcus. Marcus brought the tablet. This estate has 47 cameras, Damien said. The room gave him its attention immediately, the way rooms always did. Every hallway, every room, the wine cellar included. 24 hours. He pressed play. The ballroom screen set up for the wine presentation filled with the black and white feed from the cellar. Timestamp, 11:12 p.m. Elena entering. Damien arriving. The conversation. Both of them leaving, Elena, for the full duration of the footage. Never approached the wine rack except to read the inventory list she'd been holding. Then he advanced the timestamp, 3:17 a.m., a figure on the stairs. Moving carefully, deliberately, a face everyone in the room knew. Celeste, the room inhaled. On the screen, Celeste moved to the wine rack, retrieved the century-old bottle, poured from a small vial, resealed it, replaced it exactly. And then she did something that stopped the room completely. She turned and looked directly into the camera. 1 full second. Her eyes straight into the lens of camera 47. Then she walked out. She knew. She had always known where the cameras were. She had made herself visible on purpose because she needed Damien to see her face and know, without any possible doubt, that this was a choice she made, that no one could take it from her, that James Hargrove could not claim it was an accident or a misunderstanding or someone else's doing. She had chosen her exit, and she had chosen it looking straight at the camera. The room erupted. James Hargrove's face went the particular gray of a man watching his entire construction collapse in real time. Damien stepped down from the dais. He moved through the crowd. People stepped aside. He stopped in front of Elena. He did not take her hand. He did not make a declaration of ownership. He stood beside her and faced the room. And there was a difference, Elena thought, between a man who stands in front of you to protect you and a man who stands beside you to show everyone where he is. She had lived with the first kind. She was only just learning what the second kind looked like. Elena Vasquez came to this house to cover for her mother, Damien said. Her mother, who has worked here for 18 years with complete dedication. She managed this event with more professionalism than most people I've paid full salary. And when she was accused publicly and without evidence, she stood up and spoke for herself before I could say a word. He paused. Let it sit. What you heard tonight about her father, her background, her clothing that tells you nothing about who she is. It tells you something about the person who said it, and something about what some of you were willing to believe before she'd even finished speaking. He looked at James Hargrove. Mr. Hargrove, we'll talk tonight. James had no response, not a single word. An hour later, the guests were gone. The estate was quiet in the particular way of a space that has just held something large and let it go. Elena went to the garden. She didn't go to think. She went because she needed air, and because the house suddenly felt very full of other people's emotions, and she wanted to stand somewhere with just her own for a while. The white gravel path was cool under her feet. The roses were dark shapes in the low garden lighting. The city was a sound beyond the walls. She crouched near the garden border, between two white decorative stones. Something caught the light differently than the gravel. She picked it up, turned it in her fingers. A small piece of sea glass. Blue-green, worn, smooth. The color of the ocean on a cloudy afternoon. She didn't know how it had gotten here, in this garden, in this place so far from any beach. She held it for a moment, then put it in her pocket. She stood, looked out at the dark garden for another minute, then went inside. From the second-floor window, Damien watched her go. He had seen her crouch, had seen her pick something up, had seen her hold it a moment before pocketing it. He didn't know what it was. He stayed at the window after she'd gone inside, looking at the garden, thinking about the specific way she'd stood when the room turned on her. The stillness of her hands, the steadiness of her voice, the way she'd spoken not to defend herself, but to tell the truth like the truth was the only tool she was interested in using. He stayed at the window for a long time. The morning after the gala, the estate was quiet in a different way than usual, not peaceful. Processing. Lena found Damien in his study at 9. He wasn't working. He was sitting, which she'd learned was unusual for him. He sat the way people sit when they've been awake most of the night thinking through something. She sat across from him without being invited. He didn't object. I want to see the clinic, she said, a long pause. How long have you known? Since the second night, the Harrisons. The way you leave some afternoons and come back different. The way Marcus's posture changes at a certain location, like he's standing outside something private rather than guarding something dangerous. She paused. Medical students watch things. So do nurses. He looked at her. Why do you want to see it? Because you've seen the worst thing about my past. I want to see the best thing about yours. They drove to Harlem in the early afternoon. Damien changed in the back seat, not a disguise, just off the suit. Gray Henley, the kind of shirt that means nothing on its own. The clinic was a converted storefront on a street that had a bodega on one corner and a laundromat on the other. Clean inside. Warm in the way places get warm when the person who runs them actually cares about what happens there. Dr. Whitfield, 60. Unhurried. With the deep competence of someone who'd been practicing general medicine for 30 years, greeted Damien the way you greet someone you've worked alongside for 6 years without needing to discuss the strangeness of the arrangement. He was the public face, the licensed physician. The name on the filing, Damien was the volunteer specialist who appeared twice a month, gave a different first name, and asked nothing in return for funding the whole operation. Damien put on the white coat, the name badge, D. Ryan, volunteer specialist. Elena sat in the waiting room. She watched. The room was full. A young mother with a toddler who had been feverish for 3 days. too sick to go to daycare, no insurance to cover a regular pediatrician, an elderly man with a prescription he couldn't afford to fill at the pharmacy 2 blocks away, a teenager with a hand injury from a construction site that didn't carry workers' compensation. Real people, real needs. The specific, unglamorous reality of what it meant to not have access to the system that was supposed to exist for everyone. Then Damien came out with his first patient. He was entirely different. Controlled removal of the estate was gone. The careful blankness he wore in every room where someone might be watching was gone. He moved with the unhurried focus of someone who had exactly one thing they needed to do and all the time in the world to do it right. He made eye contact with his patients in a way Elena recognized. She had practiced that skill for 4 years. Full presence. The ability to make a person feel like they were the only thing in the room that mattered. Because for the next 10 minutes, they were. It was harder than it looked. Most people never mastered it. He had it naturally, or had worked for it so long it had become natural. She couldn't tell which. After an hour, she noticed the intake nurse was running behind. She didn't ask anyone's permission. She just started helping organizing files, explaining paperwork, translating for a Spanish-speaking woman who was struggling with the consent form. Nobody directed her. She just saw the need and moved. When Damien came out between patients and found her at the intake desk, he stopped in the middle of the hallway. He watched her kneel beside an older man to show him where to sign. Watched her switch languages mid-sentence for the woman with the consent form. Watched her give the intake nurse a look that said, "Go take 5 minutes. I've got this," and the nurse exhaled and went. He stood there, just watching. Marcus, outside in the car, got a text. "We're running long," he replied. "I know. On the drive back." The city moved past the windows, and neither of them talked for a while. The silence was easy. It had been getting easier. Eventually, Elena said, "You could go back to finish the degree." "I know. Then why haven't you?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because for 7 years, I've been telling myself that what I was doing was what Connor would have wanted. That the family, the operation, that was the honoring of it." He looked at the window. "And somewhere in the last 4 days, I've started understanding that I've been wrong about that for a very long time." She didn't say anything. Some things didn't need a response. They just needed someone to hear them. That evening, Elena was on the estate rooftop for air. She had a phone call for her therapist in Philadelphia, bi-weekly calls, for 2 years. Some people went to therapy because they believed in it. Elena went because she'd understood, in a hospital room in Philadelphia, that she had been trying to carry something alone that was too heavy to carry alone. And she had decided, finally, to ask for help. The call was ending when Damien came up. She heard the last thing she said into the phone. "I think something is shifting. I'll tell you more next week." She hung up, saw him. "Sorry, I didn't know you came up here." "You can stay." He sat on the ledge. She stayed where she was, a few feet away. The city below them, doing what cities do at this hour, turning over, settling in, preparing for morning. After a while, Elena looked at her left wrist. She took the bracelet off, set it on the ledge beside her. Just that. No explanation. She just took it off. "His name was Ryan," she said. She told him. Not every detail, the shape of it. Who she had been at 22 and what she had mistaken Ryan for, and the specific, long process of understanding the difference between someone who wants to protect you and someone who wants to own you, and how those two things can look identical until they don't. She told him about the night she stopped, about the ER in Philadelphia, about the nurse who looked at her and said 3 words, "This is not your fault," in the specific tone of someone who had said it 100 times and meant it every single time. Damien listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't say, "I'm sorry" as filler, or "that must have been so hard" as a script. He listened the way she'd watched him listen to his patients today, with everything. No performance. No distance. Just there. When she finished, he said, "Thank you for telling me." That was it. The right thing. He found it without looking. She looked at him. "What would you tell Connor if you could?" He was quiet a long time. The city hummed below them. "That I'm sorry I buried my life when I buried his." He said finally, "That I think he would have hated knowing I did that. That I'm still figuring out how to stop." "You already started," she said. "The clinic is not the behavior of someone who stopped. The clinic is what I could manage without admitting what it actually meant. And now, he looked at her. And now I'm on a rooftop at 11 o'clock telling you things I haven't said out loud to anyone. So I think now is different from before. He reached out slow, deliberate, and stopped. Waited, not asking with words. Just waiting to see what she did. She didn't move away. He touched her face the way she'd seen his hands work in the clinic, like the thing he was reaching for was something he didn't want to damage. The first kiss was quiet, the exhale after a held breath. Two people being honest in the same place at the same time, which was, Elena thought, probably the most genuine form of intimacy there actually was. When they pulled back, she said, I'm not done healing. I want you to know that up front. I know. It means it's going to be complicated. Most things worth anything are. She looked at the bracelet on the ledge beside her, left it there for another minute, then picked it up and put it in her pocket instead of back on her wrist. Not thrown away, just no longer needed as armor tonight. The next morning, Marcus came to the study. Damien told him his plan for handling James Hargrove and the way he said it, the flatness and the particular precision of it. Told Marcus everything about which version of himself Damien intended to use. Marcus set down what he was carrying. No, he said. Damien looked at him. No, Marcus said again. Steady, unhurried. Not like that. Not this time. Marcus Connor didn't die, so you could spend the rest of your life proving how much it cost you. He said it the way you say something you've been holding for a long time and have finally decided is worth the discomfort of saying. He died because of this world. Every time you handle things the old way, you make more of this world. Not less. The room was very quiet. I have been with you for 7 years. Marcus continued. I have watched you run a clinic in secret and order medical textbooks every time a new edition comes out and sit in that study at 2 in the morning like you're preparing for an exam you refuse to take. I know who you are under the part of yourself that you let me help you be. He paused. And I am telling you as your friend that you have a different choice right now. And the woman in this house is watching to see which one you make. Damien was very still. You've never said that before, he said, that you have a choice. That you're my friend. Marcus picked up what he'd set down. Well, now I have. He moved toward the door. Lawyers. Evidence. Get Celeste to give us the Hargrove documentation. She's been waiting for someone to ask. He left. Damien sat for a long moment in the quiet of the study. Then he opened his laptop. He didn't go to the Hargrove files. He opened the Columbia Medical School portal, found the re-enrollment page, the page he had opened and closed 7 times in 3 years. He typed his name. He kept going. Sophia found Celeste in the east sitting room that afternoon. Sitting alone, looking at the window. Sophia sat beside her without preamble. She had her law school bag with her. I know what you did in that cellar, she said. I know why you did it, and I know how to help you do what comes next legally. Completely, in a way that protects you. Celeste looked at her. Why would you help me? Because you're not the villain of this story, and you've always known it. And because my brother deserves to run this family without someone else's crimes wrapped around it, like a collar. Sophia opened her bag. Tell me everything. From the beginning. I'll take notes. Celeste looked at the window for another moment. Then she turned and started talking. Marcus brought the information to Damien on a Tuesday afternoon. And the way he set it down carefully, like something with edges, told Damien before he'd read a word that this was going to require a different kind of attention. Ryan Cole had been in New York for 4 days. He had not come through any organized channel. He had not been hired by Marchetti or anyone connected to Marchetti. He had found Elena the ordinary way. A community newspaper, a small feature about a South Bronx nonprofit volunteer. A photograph just clear enough for someone who knew her face. He had seen her face. And then he had done what people like Ryan Cole did. He had started watching. He had followed Damien twice. He had connected the consistent timing, the specific neighborhood in Harlem, the rotating clinic addresses, the name on the door that wasn't the right name. He was not unintelligent. He was not connected. He had simply paid attention long enough to find something he believed he could use. He wanted money, not a dramatic confrontation, not revenge. Money from Elena, or from Damien, or from whoever responded first and fastest. He had 2 things to sell: his version of Elena's past, which he had spent 2 years polishing into something that made her sound unstable and dishonest, and the clinic. He hasn't contacted anyone yet, Marcus said, but he's been in the neighborhood twice. He's building up to it. Damien read the report. Set it down. Tell Elena, he said. Marcus looked at him. You're sure? She has the right to know what's coming, and she has the right to decide how she wants to handle it. He said it flatly, like it was obvious. Maybe, finally, it was. Damien found Elena in the garden with her notebook. She looked up when she heard him coming, not startled, just attentive. She'd always been like that, aware of a room without performing awareness. He sat across from her on the low garden wall and told her directly. All of it. Ryan was in the city. He knew about the clinic. He was looking for a payout. She went still, not the frozen stillness of shock, the deliberate stillness of someone thinking clearly and fast. What does he want? Money, from you or from me, whichever's easier. And if he doesn't get it, he takes the clinic to the press, probably your history along with it. Elena looked at the notebook in her hands. She didn't open it. She just held it. His version of my history, she said, is not something I'm interested in managing. She looked up. What I care about is the clinic staying open. I know. Does he know that? No, good. She set the notebook down. Then he doesn't understand the situation he's actually in. She looked at Damien steadily. I have a restraining order from Pennsylvania. Eastern District, still active. If he approaches me on New York soil, he violates it. That's federal jurisdiction. Your lawyers can move on that faster than he can move on anything. Damien was quiet a moment. Elena, don't. Not unkind. Just clear. Let me handle this correctly. The clinic stays open. You go back to medical school. And Ryan Cole leaves this city with nothing. That's the outcome I want. Can your lawyers make that happen if I initiate the complaint? Yes, then let's do it right. She picked up her notebook again. Opened it. Started writing. He watched her for a moment, the focused calm of her, the particular quality she had of treating hard things as problems to be solved rather than disasters to be survived. And then he went to call his attorneys. Sophia ran the background check. Elena had asked her 2 days ago, when Damien first told her Ryan was in the city. She hadn't explained why she wanted it. Sophia hadn't asked. She just said, give me 48 hours and gone to work. What she found. 2 civil fraud complaints in different states. 1 closed criminal investigation. A pattern of financial coercion against a previous employer. Nothing that had landed him in prison. Enough that would look very bad in the context of a federal restraining order violation. Elena read the summary report at the kitchen table the morning before the gala. She folded it carefully and put it in her bag. She didn't tell anyone she had it. She just waited. Ryan got into the estate through the staff entrance. He'd paid someone for the access not with much money, just with the right information about the right person's vulnerability. The particular ugly efficiency of someone who had spent years identifying what people were afraid of and using it. He found Elena in the downstairs sitting room. He looked exactly the same. That was the thing that hit her first. He looked exactly as he had the day she met him. Same ease, same smile, same way of walking into a room like the room had been waiting for him. That particular sameness was its own kind of information. Hey, Ellie, Elena, she said. Her heart rate was up. She could feel it, the specific physiological response to this specific face. The nervous system doing what it was built to do, recognizing something it had learned to be afraid of. She could not stop that response. She had stopped expecting to be able to stop it. What she could do was let it happen and keep her feet where they were. She kept her feet where they were. You look good, he said, moving closer. The old choreography closing distance, establishing presence, reminding her of what that proximity used to mean. Don't, she said. Don't what? Just ex-husband. 2 years final. And the Eastern District restraining order is still active. You know that. He stopped. The smile recalibrated. She'd seen this before, the micro-adjustment when a tactic didn't land. The pivot to the next one. You want to talk about the doctor, he said, letting it hang. Your new friend in Harlem. Dr. Ryan, a pause. Interesting name choice for a man named Damien Rourke. Lena said nothing. I've been watching, he said. I know what the clinic is. I know what it means to him. I know what would happen to his position if his enemies found out the most feared man in this city has been playing doctor in Harlem twice a month. He tilted his head slightly. I think we should talk about what keeping that quiet is worth. Silence. Elena reached into her bag. She took out the folded report Sophia had compiled and set it on the table between them without ceremony. I've been watching too, she said. 2 civil fraud complaints, 1 closed criminal investigation. A pattern that, in the context of a federal restraining order violation, which is what you're currently committing, would be very interesting to a prosecutor looking for context. She looked at him steadily. You have 60 seconds to leave this property before I make 2 calls. The first is to NYPD to report the violation in progress. The second is to the U.S. Attorney's Office contact that Mr. Rourke's lawyers have already briefed on your presence in this city. Ryan went very still. I know you came here thinking you had leverage, Elena said. You came here with a version of my story that you've been polishing for 2 years and information about a man you think is vulnerable. But here's what you didn't account for. She held his gaze. I'm not afraid of your version of my story. I lived the real one. And the man you thought you found vulnerable has been building a legal case against people like you for a very long time. 40 seconds. Ryan looked at the report, at Elena. At the door. He left. Marcus, who had been in the doorway for the last 90 seconds, still as furniture watched him go. Then he looked at Elena. Are you all right? My hands are shaking, she said, looking at them. But yes, I'm all right. Those are different things, he said quietly. Yes, she said, they are. Sophia found her 20 minutes later. Elena was in the east sitting room, on the small sofa, hands wrapped around a glass of water she wasn't drinking. Sophia came in and sat beside her and didn't ask for a summary or a debrief or anything at all. She just sat. A minute passed. Elena, I hate that my hands still shake. That's your nervous system, Sophia said. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, protecting you from something it associates with danger. It doesn't know the danger is over. It will learn. It takes longer than we want it to, but it learns. That's very specific. Victim Advocacy Unit. Also, I've read all of Damien's medical books, the ones on the secondary desk that he thinks no one notices. Elena looked at her. Then, for the first time in hours, she laughed. Short and real and completely unplanned. Sophia patted her knee once, then sat back. From the doorway, Damien appeared. He took in the room Sophia beside Elena, the tension in Elena's shoulders starting to ease. The glass of water she was finally drinking. He read it the way she'd watched him read everything, quickly, accurately, without needing it explained. He did not come in. He stood there one moment. Then he stepped back and walked away. He went to his study, opened the laptop, navigated to the Columbia Medical Portal, the re-enrollment page he'd started filling out 2 nights ago. He finished it, submitted it, closed the laptop. He sat in the quiet of the study for a while, and for the first time in 7 years. The quiet felt like something other than the space where Connor used to be. Ryan Cole was detained 2 blocks from the estate by 2 officers responding to the restraining order violation call. The processing was faster than it would normally be, because Damien's legal team had prepared the paperwork 3 days in advance, as soon as Marcus first confirmed Ryan was in the city, because that was what Damien had done this time. Not sent someone, not made a quiet phone call that solved the problem in the dark. He had called his attorneys, built the file correctly, and waited for Elena to decide what she wanted to do with it. The arraignment happened the next morning. Ryan's attorney reviewed the civil fraud history Sophia's research had surfaced, reviewed the federal restraining order violation, reviewed the attempted extortion documentation that Marks had recorded through the estate's security system. The attorney advised, clearly and without ambiguity, that his client should accept the plea. Ryan accepted. New York jurisdiction, 5-year restraining order, mandatory departure from the state within 14 days. He left. Elena was not present for any of it. She was at the nonprofit that morning, her first real volunteer shift, which she had scheduled 3 weeks ago, and was not willing to reschedule for Ryan Cole or anyone connected to him. She was folding handout packets with Diego, who had asked if he could come along because he wanted to do something useful with a Tuesday when Marcus's text came through. She read it, set the phone down, kept folding. Diego looked at her. Good news! Good outcome, she said. Those are a little different. He thought about that. How? Good news feels like luck. A good outcome means something was built to make it happen. She handed him the next stack. These took 4 days of planning and 2 years of a restraining order I made sure to keep active. That's not luck. That's preparation. Diego folded in silence for a moment. Your mom raised you right, he said. Elena smiled. She really did. Nora came to find Elena after breakfast. She walked with the particular care she used when what she was carrying wasn't furniture or linens or a schedule change. The care of someone transporting something fragile. There's a man at the service gate, she said. He's been standing outside since 6 this morning. He says his name is Victor Vasquez. Elena set down her coffee. He doesn't want to come in, Nora continued. He said specifically that he doesn't have the right to ask. He has 2 letters, one for you and one for your mother. He just wants to know if someone can take them. Elena looked at the window, outside, past the garden and the iron gates. Her father was standing on a sidewalk he didn't feel he deserved to cross. 20 years, and he'd chosen the service gate. She wasn't sure what that said about him. Maybe that he knew his place in the story. Maybe that he'd spent so long on the outside of things that the main entrance didn't occur to him anymore. Let him in, she said, one of the smaller rooms. I'll be there in 10 minutes, she told Damien first. Not because she needed his permission, because she had started telling him things. And this was a thing. He listened. Then, do you want to see him? No. She thought about it honestly. But I know I'll spend years wondering if I don't. That's not the same as wanting to. No, but it's enough of a reason. She stood. How do I look? He looked at her steadily. Like someone who doesn't need the answer to that question. She almost smiled. Useful, she said, and went. The man in the small sitting room was 65 years old and looked more than that. White hair, thin frame, the posture of someone who had been folding inward for a long time, not from age, but from the particular weight of knowing what you did and carrying it without being able to set it down. His eyes were dark brown. Elena's eyes were dark brown. She had always known this from photographs. Seeing it in person was different, stranger, like finding your own handwriting in someone else's notebook. He didn't stand when she came in. He sat with his hands on his knees, like he was waiting to be told what he was allowed to do. Elena, he said. Victor, she said. Not dad, not father. Victor. He didn't flinch from it. You look like your mother, he said. You have her posture. Why are you here? He took a breath. Not performing it, just needing it. I read something. A community newspaper. A small article about a volunteer at a nonprofit in the Bronx. He paused. There was a photograph. I almost missed it, but I recognized you. So you came. I came because I read that article, and I understood something I had been lying to myself about for a long time. He looked at his hands. I had been telling myself I stayed away for your sake, that my absence was the least harm I could do after everything. And then I saw that photograph, and you are. He stopped, started again. You are someone remarkable, and I had nothing to do with that. Your mother did that. You did that. I couldn't keep pretending that staying away was noble. It was cowardice. It has always been cowardice. Elena sat across from him. Not close. She let the silence be what it was. The money, she said. The anonymous transfers. 15 years. Yes, why anonymous? He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd sat down. Because I didn't have the courage to sign my name. She sat with that. It helped, she said. She doesn't know where it came from, but it helped. Something moved across his face. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter than that. Good, he said. Just that word. Like it was the only thing he'd wanted to hear in 20 years, and it was enough and too small at the same time. Yelena looked at him for a long moment. I need to tell you something, she said. Her voice was even. I cannot forgive you today. I may not be able to for a long time. I'm not going to apologize for that or perform a feeling I don't have. You don't get to walk back in here and have everything cleaned because you finally found the courage to knock on a gate. He nodded. He'd expected this. You didn't try to argue with it. But I've been carrying the weight of your leaving like it meant something about me, she continued. Like it was a verdict on my worth. On my mother's worth. I'm done carrying that. I'm letting it go not for you, for me. Because it's too heavy and it's been mine long enough. She met his eyes. You can leave the letter for my mother with Nora. After that, we'll see. That's everything I can give you right now. Victor Vasquez nodded slowly. His eyes were wet. He didn't make it about that. Thank you for seeing me, he said. Don't disappear again, she said. Whatever else happens, don't do that again. She called Carmen from the hallway after. Her mother listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then, read me the letter. Baby, Mom, read it to me. Please. Elena opened the envelope. 3 pages. Handwritten, in the careful cursive of a man who hadn't written letters often and knew this one mattered. No elaborate language. Just plain sentences about plain things what he'd been afraid of. What he'd done wrong. What the 15 years of transfers had been. What he would ask for if he had any right to ask. Elena, read it. Her voice held until the 3rd page. Then it didn't, and she stopped until it did. When she finished, she heard her mother's breathing change. Mija, what do you want to do? Elena asked. A long pause. The kind that meant Carmen was actually deciding, not just gathering herself. I want to be very angry at him, she said finally. For a very long time. That part is true. A pause. But I also want to see him. Not to forgive him. Not yet. But I need to see with my own eyes whether he became someone different or whether he's still the man I knew who just got older. I need to know that, okay? Elena said. Is that all right? Mom, you don't need my permission for anything. No, but I want to know you're okay. Elena leaned against the hallway wall. Outside the window, the garden was still and bright. I'm okay, she said. I'm working on it, but I'm okay. That evening, Damien made tea without being asked, and they sat at the kitchen table together. He told her about his own father eventually. Not the Empire version, the person version. A man who loved his sons in the specific, limited way of someone who had never learned to love anything that didn't fit inside a plan. He never asked us what we wanted, Damien said. Not once. Not because he was cruel, because it didn't occur to him that what we wanted was separate from what he'd already decided. Does understanding why change what he did? No, he said. But it changes what I do with the anger. It stops being about him. It becomes something I have to figure out what to do with on my own. Elena nodded. That's the part no one tells you. No, he said. No one does. Nora asked to speak with Elena privately on a Wednesday morning. Not about work. Elena could tell the difference. Now had learned to read Nora the way you learned to read anything you paid enough attention to. Work conversations had a different weight than personal ones. This one was personal. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them. Your mother was more than a housekeeper in this house, Nora said. She never told you that because she never thought her presence was significant enough to mention. That's what happens when the world teaches you that your role is functional rather than human. You start to believe it. Elena waited. Connor used to come down here, Nora said. After midnight, sometimes. Sat at this table. Your mother would make him tea and they would talk. Not about the business, about his life, what he wanted from it, what he was afraid of. For how long? About 4 years. From the time he was 26 until 3 weeks before he died. The kitchen was very quiet. What did they talk about? Everything. The cost of leading a family like this when you didn't choose it. What he'd do differently if he could. And one night, Carmen told me this herself. Years after he said something she'd never been asked before. Nora held her coffee cup without drinking from it. He asked her, what do you want? Carmen, for your life, for your daughter, for yourself. Elena's throat tightened. She sat there a full minute before she could answer, Nora said, because nobody in this house had ever asked her. She was the housekeeper. She kept the rooms running. She wasn't someone who got asked. What did she say? She told him she wanted Elena to know she was enough, exactly as she was, that she never needed to earn her place in any room. Nora looked at her. He wrote it down. Told Marcus the next week that your mother's answer was the most important thing anyone had said to him in years. He had a meeting scheduled to start moving the family toward legitimate income, away from the old way of doing things. The week after the ambush, she paused. He never made it. Elena looked at the table, but Damien did. Nora continued. 3 years later. The clinic. The restructuring he's been working on for 2 years now. I have never said this to him because it wasn't mine to say. But I believe I have always believed that some version of what your mother gave Connor that night at this table found its way to Damien through the grief. That Carmen Vasquez changed the direction of this family, and she will never know it. Elena didn't speak for a long moment. Why are you telling me this now? Nora looked at her steadily. Because you came here thinking you were filling in for your mother. And I need you to understand that your mother was never filling a role in this house. She was a person who changed something here. Something real. And you were raised by her. She paused. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. James Hargrove was contacted for federal interview on a Thursday. He called Damien immediately expecting loyalty, expecting the protection the engagement was supposed to guarantee. Damien told him, calmly and without drama, that the engagement was dissolved, that Celeste was no longer subject to any arrangement connected to her father's legal situation, and that the Rourke legal team would be cooperating fully with the inquiry. James, we have an understanding. Damien, we had an arrangement built on conditions you misrepresented. That's a contract made in bad faith. It's not an understanding. He hung up. The investigation that followed would take months. The outcome belonged to a different story. What mattered was the phone call what Damien chose in the moment he had the choice. Celeste got her keys on a Friday. Small apartment, new neighborhood. Lease in her name only. She sat on the floor of the empty living room, no furniture yet. Nothing placed, and she asked herself what she wanted for breakfast. Not what the arrangement required. Not what her father would approve of. What she actually wanted. She decided on eggs. Walked to the diner on the corner. Sat at the counter. Ordered. Ate alone with a newspaper and left a good tip and walked back to her empty apartment and stood in the middle of it with the window open and the street noise coming in. Sophia texted her that afternoon. How does it feel? Celeste looked around the empty room. Quiet, she typed back. Good quiet. Damien visited Father Michael that week for the first time in 8 months. They sat in the old priest's study books. Coffee. The particular stillness of a room that had held a great many difficult conversations and knew how to make room for one more. You look different, Father Michael said. I enrolled at Columbia. Father Michael nodded, once the slow nod of someone who has been waiting a long time and is not going to make a big thing of the waiting being over. Connor asked me once what I thought you'd do, he said, if something happened to him. I told him I thought you'd do the right thing eventually. What did he say? He said that wasn't an answer. The priest smiled faintly. I said it was the only honest one. Damien looked at him. Do you think it's the right thing? I think you already know that. Think you came here to hear someone else say it? Father Michael set down his cup. It's the right thing, Damien. It was always the right thing. Connor knew that. Your mother knew that. The only person who needed convincing was you. 3 months later, Carmen had a window, 14th floor, east-facing, her name on the office door. She managed the Rourke family's legitimate property holdings, now a role that reflected what 20 years of professional expertise was actually worth when someone decided to pay attention to it. She had accepted after 2 weeks of thinking it over. She'd spent those weeks asking people she trusted whether this was real. The answer she kept receiving was the same. It's neither charity nor luck. It's overdue. She started on a Monday, wore her good blazer, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and looked out the window for a full minute before she opened her calendar. She allowed herself that. Victor came to the apartment twice in 3 months. Both visits were at the kitchen table. Both were difficult and imperfect and necessary. Carmen had not forgiven him. She was also not finished with him. She had made this decision on her own timeline and explained it to no one. Elena had not pushed in either direction. What Elena had done was show up to both visits, sit in the other chair, and let her mother lead. That was the whole of her contribution. And it was enough. Sophia was in the NYU Law Library at 2 in the morning when her phone rang. A client from the advocacy unit. A voice she recognized, one of the women who had been slowly, carefully building towards something in the group sessions Elena ran. Something had happened tonight. She needed help. Sophia picked up on the first ring. She was already reaching for her coat before the woman had finished the sentence. The dinner was Damien's idea. He suggested Carmen and Victor's apartment in the Bronx. Elena was surprised he always hosted. He said simply, I want to eat where you grew up. She thought about arguing. Then she didn't. The table was crowded and loud and imperfect in all the ways that real dinners are. Carmen cooked. Victor sat carefully, like someone still learning the rules of a space he wasn't sure he'd been fully admitted to. Nora appeared without being summoned, as she always did. Sophia arrived late with dessert from a bakery she loved. Marcus came because Elena had told him plainly, Damien won't invite you because he doesn't know how to. But you should come. He came, partway through the meal. The salt got knocked across the table. Victor caught it before it fell. Passed it to Damien. Damien took it. And quietly, just between them. Debts have a way of outliving their purpose, he said. The ones that matter are the ones you carry yourself. Victor looked at him, received it, nodded once. Not forgiveness, not absolution. Just two men at a table, acknowledging that the past was the past and tonight was tonight. Then Damien tapped his glass gently, and the table went quiet. I have something to say. He looked around at them: Carmen, Victor, Nora, Sophia, Marcus. The particular collection of people this year had assembled. I've re-enrolled at Columbia, part-time, 3 years, probably more. The clinic is being properly funded and staffed going forward. And the family business is being restructured. Legitimate income takes priority. It's not going to be fast or clean, but it's what we're doing. Silence for one beat. Then Sophia started clapping real, enthusiastic, completely unself-conscious applause. Nora allowed herself the full smile she usually kept mostly hidden. Carmen pressed both hands over her mouth. Marcus, from his chair in the corner, gave one slow nod. Victor Vasquez looked across the table at Damien Rourke and thought about a man named Connor who had once sat in a kitchen and written something down. He didn't say this. Some things belong to the person who thought them. After dinner, Damien found Elena on the small balcony. The view from here was nothing like the estate. Rooftops and water towers, an elevated train 2 blocks over, and the bodega on the corner where she'd bought candy at age 8. This is where you're from, Damien said. Yes, he stood beside her and looked at it, not performing admiration. Just looking. It's good, he said. She knew he meant it. After a moment, he reached into his jacket pocket. Not a box, just a ring. Held in his palm. Small. A smooth stone. Blue-green. The color of sea glass worn round by water. Set simply in silver. Nothing that required performance to receive. Elena looked at it for a long moment. Where did your mother mention Rockaway? Said you collected sea glass when you were little. He kept his voice quiet. I found a jeweler. Described the color I was looking for. He had listened. That was what the ring meant. He had paid attention not to what would impress her, but to what would be true to her. I'm not asking you tonight, he said. I want you to know I'm not asking tonight. No, I want to ask you after something, not instead of something. He looked at the ring in his palm. After the first year back at Columbia, after the clinic has a pediatric unit, after I've had more conversations like the one I had with Marcus that I should have had 6 years ago. He paused. I want to build something worth asking you into. Elena looked at the ring, then at him. My grandmother used to say when you stop counting the reasons to wait and start counting the reasons you're glad you stayed. That's when you know something is real. He was quiet. Do you know yet? He asked. I'm starting to. She took the ring from his hand, closed her fingers around it. She didn't put it on. Build your thing, she said. I'll be here. From inside. Through the glass door, Sophia saw them. She put down her fork. She very carefully did not look at anyone at the table. Under the table, she texted Marcus. Don't look at the balcony, Marcus, without moving. Already not looking. The bracelet was in Elena's pocket. Had been for 2 weeks. She didn't put it on in the mornings anymore. Didn't take it out and look at it. It was just there present without being necessary. Her grandmother had made it the summer before she died. Elena had worn it as armor for 4 years. And then one night on a different rooftop, she had taken it off and set it on a ledge and told the truth out loud to someone who listened. And she had not needed it the same way after that. Some things you carry until you don't have to. Then you put them in your pocket and keep moving. End of session at the nonprofit. The room emptying, chairs scraping, people gathering their things. The woman from the far corner, the one who had looked up on Elena's first day, stopped beside her on the way out. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand briefly on Elena's arm. Elena covered it with her own hand. They stood like that for one moment. Then the woman left. Elena stayed in the empty room a few seconds longer, alone with the folded chairs and the quiet. She did what she did at the end of every shift. She took a breath, acknowledged what had just happened in this room today, and got ready for what came next. Then she picked up her bag and walked out into the afternoon. 6 months later, Elena was in the middle of a group session when she noticed it. Not the ring. She'd stopped noticing the ring weeks ago, which was the whole point of it. She noticed the woman across the circle noticing it. late 40s. New to the group, eyes that hadn't fully decided yet whether this room was safe. She'd been watching Elena's hands all session, the way Elena held her coffee cup, the way she listened, the way she didn't rush anyone to finish their sentence. And then her eyes stopped on the ring. Blue-green stone, simple silver band, the color of ocean glass on a cloudy afternoon. The woman didn't ask about it, but something in her face shifted small, barely visible. A particular shift of someone who has just registered, without words, that the person across from them has also been somewhere hard and came back wearing something beautiful. Elena caught her eye, held it, didn't explain the ring, didn't need to. She just said, the way she always started, "Take whatever time you need. We're not going anywhere." The woman looked down at her own hands. Then, slowly, she began to talk. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event. In the end, Elena Vasquez did not walk into the Rourke estate to be rescued by a powerful man. She entered those iron gates because her mother needed her, carrying an unpacked suitcase, a wounded past, and a quiet determination to never again surrender the right to choose who she would become. Damien Rourke may have possessed money, influence, and a name that made powerful men lower their voices. But Elena brought something into his world that power alone could never buy: the courage to tell the truth without asking whether the room was ready to hear it. And perhaps that is the first lesson this story leaves with us. We are not defined by the families we were born into, the people who betrayed us, or the mistakes made in our name. Elena's father had abandoned his family. Her former husband had tried to control, frighten, and rewrite her story. Wealthy strangers judged her by her clothes, her background, and the work her mother performed. Yet none of those things determined her character. Her identity was revealed through her choices, through the way she worked when no one was praising her, the way she listened to people others treated as invisible, and the way she stood in the center of a hostile ballroom and refused to apologize for a crime she had never committed. Her life reminds us that another person may describe our past, but they do not have the authority to define our worth. This story also teaches us that healing does not always look like fear disappearing. Sometimes healing looks like trembling hands that still reach for the right door. Elena's body remembered Ryan even after her mind understood that she was free. Her heart raced when he entered the room. Her hand shook after he left. But she stayed where she was, spoke her own name, used the law she had carefully kept in place, and refused to return to the frightened version of herself he expected to find. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was her decision that fear would no longer make choices for her. Many people believe they must feel completely strong before they can confront what hurt them. Elena shows us the opposite. Sometimes strength is built during the confrontation, with one breath, one boundary, and one honest sentence at a time. Damien's journey carries a different but equally important lesson. A person can be powerful and still be imprisoned. For 7 years, Damien convinced himself that guilt was loyalty. He believed that abandoning his dream of becoming a doctor was the price he had to pay for surviving his brother. He ruled an empire, protected a family, and inspired fear throughout the city. Yet, he could not walk through the door he secretly kept open. The medical books, the hidden clinic, and the late-night studying were proof that the man he had buried was still alive beneath the armor. Elena did not save that man for him. She simply recognized him and refused to let him lie about what she saw. She reminded him that doors do not expire, that grief is not a life sentence, and that honoring the dead should never require destroying the life they wanted us to live. But Damien's true transformation was not proven by the clinic, the medical school application, or even by the love he felt for Elena. It was proven by the way he chose to use his power. When Ryan threatened Elena and the clinic, Damien could have solved the problem through fear, secrecy, or violence. That was the language his world had taught him. Instead, he told Elena the truth, gave her the right to decide what happened next, and used evidence, attorneys, and the law. He did not take control of her battle. He stood beside her while she fought it herself. That difference matters. Protection says, you are capable, and I will support your choice. Control says, I know what is best, so your choice no longer matters. Elena had already lived with a man who confused possession with love. Damien had to prove that he understood the difference. Love did not make Elena smaller so that he could feel stronger. It made room for her voice, her boundaries, her healing, and her independence.